Welcome to Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, Part 4. Here we're going to take a look at the Problemata section, which begins with what is known as the Preamble from the heart. In the Preamble, Kierkegaard is going to take exception to those people who accept the truth of conventional wisdom. In other words, those followers of Hegel, the Hegelians, those that are part of that tradition from Descartes to Hegel, who are seeking the absolute but also the objective reality of things. He says that those people, they know the story of Abraham word for word, but they don't really understand it. They don't really think about it. Those are the same people who are going to be the first to cry out sin when anyone else tries to act in the way that Abraham does. I mean, if you think about it, here you've got these kids, and one of the things that's done is kids are given these Bible verses they're expected to memorize and recite back, and a lot of times they win prizes for being able to recite these back, who's able to recite the most and so on. But just because a person can memorize and recite something doesn't mean that they've understood what it's about. It doesn't mean that it's touched their heart. It doesn't mean that it's done anything ultimately for them. Now, they don't realize that because they've got their little piece of candy or their toy or whatever, and that's what they were in it for. But in terms of the grand scheme of things as human beings, I think that it's very important for us to recognize that when we are reading these stories, we should be embracing them. We should be getting something out of them. We should be understanding them completely. And so to read something, to memorize or recite something doesn't necessarily mean that you have come to embrace it, come to accept it as the reality. It doesn't mean you've really even come to think about it. And this is where this problem comes into play. So many individuals, they read this story of the Akedah, and they applaud Abraham as this great figure who is obeying the will of God when he takes Isaac to the mountaintop to sacrifice him. But yet, what would happen in our modern world if somebody had said, "Oh, well, God told me I should take my child to the mountaintop and kill him"? We'd think that person were crazy. We'd think that person were deluded by voices in their head, that they needed psychiatric help, that they should be locked away. We wouldn't say, "Oh, look at that greatly blessed individual." We'd want to do everything we could to save the child and get that crazy lunatic off the street. But yet, where is the action of Abraham any different from the action of anyone in this world doing the same thing? Why should we believe that God spoke to Abraham just because it's written down in a book, any more than we would believe that God spoke to someone today to tell them to do this thing? From our outsider perspective, we Hegelians looking at the objective view of the world, we see the madness, we see the insanity. But Kierkegaard is going to look at it differently. He's going to see that Abraham is a person who is thrust into that situation and through his faith believes completely what it is that he is saying. But the only person that knows for sure whether he is acting upon God's whim or his own or insanity or anything else is Abraham. We simply do not know. So if we want to be in that situation of Abraham, if we want to really understand Abraham, then we have to reject this truth of conventional wisdom. We have to stop thinking like Hegelians seeking these objective facts, and we have to give ourselves over to the absolute paradox, if you will. We have to hand ourselves over through this leap of faith. Now, within this section, we are introduced to two very important concepts within Kierkegaard's writings. One is the night of infinite resignation. The other is called the night of faith. The night of infinite resignation refers to a person who does not really believe that all is well and possible with God. The knight is resigned to the Hegelian system in which all must be explainable if it's to be accepted. If something is absurd, then there is no objective validity to it, ergo it cannot be. So your knight of infinite resignation is the type of person that's going to mouth the words and claim to believe, but objective reality stands in their way. The knight of infinite resignation cannot make the leap of faith. And so for Kierkegaard, being the knight of infinite resignation is really the hardest and worst thing to be. A person who is in complete ignorance is better off than the knight of infinite resignation, because that knight knows what they have to do, but they can't bring themselves to do it. They know that they have to let go of the objective reality of this world, to embrace subjectivity completely, to take that leap of faith, but they can't do it. And so they are in a horrible situation because they know that they will never have that direct relationship with God that they seek. I guess we should mention here that what Kierkegaard is looking for, and the reason why he lets go of all these objective things and says he's too committed to take the vows to enter the clergy, and why he claims himself to be the only true Christian in all of Denmark, is the fact that he is looking for that direct personal connection, that personal relationship between himself and God. But God is an eternal being. We are temporal. We don't have the capacity to go to God. He would have to come to us. But yet, if an eternal entity entered into time, it would no longer be eternal. It would be transformed. It would become temporal too. And so God, by entering into temporality, would no longer be God, because God is eternal. This is the absolute paradox that he talks about throughout the text. And as long as we stand in that Hegelian objective standpoint, we have no way of moving around it. We have no concept of being able to fight against it. Because for us, the idea, logically, that an eternal being could enter into time without destroying itself it's an impossibility. It's an absurdity. And so that knight of infinite resignation is never going to be able to embrace that idea. They cannot make the leap of faith because they can't let go of that objective truth, that objective fact, that it would be impossible for an eternal being to enter time without destroying itself. But on the other hand, we have what's known as the knight of faith. The knight of faith recognizes the absurd, which through a leap of faith he grasps onto. The knight of faith, however, does not stand out in a crowd. Rather, he simply recognizes the impossibility presented. And in that very instant, in that very moment, he embraces the absurd. He makes the ultimate leap of faith, which completely leaves behind the objective world, the objective reality, for a pure subjectivity. In many ways, the distinction can be aided by the Eastern concept that to become the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha. Within the context of Buddhism, we have this phrase, to become the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha, which means that if you want to become like the Buddha, the first thing you have to do is to get rid of the desire to become like the Buddha. Because if you are attached to anything, including that desire, then it's going to keep you bound to this world and you will never elevate. You will never be to that position. And that's kind of the idea here. As long as you are grounded to that eternal, absolute, objective reality, where A equals A, then you're lost. You'll never get where you want to be. And so that knight of faith has to be able to overcome all of that. Like the person who wants to become the Buddha has to kill their desire to become like the Buddha. The person who wants to have that direct relationship with God has to be able to embrace the absolute paradox and to accept it for the absurdity that it is, but embrace it anyway. And that's something that, of course, is very difficult to do in both instances. On the screen, you have the figure of Don Quixote. And this is an example that Kierkegaard uses very specifically, again, in the concluding unscientific postscripts. But it works very nicely here. Don Quixote, if you're not familiar with him, was Cervantes' comic character in a novel written about 1500 or so, 1600, sorry. And anyway, Don Quixote was this individual who was an old retired man. He'd really not done much with his life. He has no great skills, no great abilities. But he spent a lot of time reading all of these romantic legends of knights in shining armor. And he looked at the world and he saw that the world that he was living in is one in which goodness seemed to be punished and those who were wicked seemed to thrive. And he felt that this was backwards, this is wrong. And so he made up his mind that he's going to go out into the world and become this great knight errant, to right the wrongs of the world, to solve the problems of the world. But of course, he's completely and utterly inept at being able to do this. He can't actually ride a horse. He has no real armor or weaponry or anything of that nature. And so he and his faithful friend are going to go out almost like a Monty Python sketch, clumping along, making it appear they're riding a horse when they're not really. And, they're going out there trying to do all of these great deeds. But what are we doing with all of these deeds? They're not really happening. At one point, Don Quixote is going to find himself in a field of windmills. But he sees not windmills, but dragons, monsters. And these monsters are terrorizing the village. And so he goes to battle. He fights with these monsters. But, of course, in the process, he gets his sword caught up in the wheel of the windmill, and he ends up swirling round and round and round and round. It's really a funny scene. But the point is that to any of us Hegelians looking on from the outside, Don Quixote is a lunatic. He's a madman. What's this idiot doing fighting windmills? But yet, from his own subjective viewpoint, he really is that great hero. He really is righting the wrongs of the world. He is bravely going into battle and fighting these villains, these monsters. And so by letting go of the objective world and embracing the subjective, he has created a reality that only exists within his own mind, which means, according to Kierkegaard, that he is closer to his truth than any of us will ever be. Because all we see is the lunacy, all we see is the madness on the outside looking in. We should be more like Don Quixote than like Hegel or Descartes, because that's what's necessary to be able to take this ultimate leap of faith. The ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he was willing to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. But in this contradiction lies the very anguish that can indeed make one sleepless. And yet without that anguish, Abraham is not the one who he is. So, as we've seen before, we shouldn't use reason or thought to objectify the subjective experience. How is it that the story is read? How is it understood? There's a matter of perception that produces a contradiction here. How do you settle this contradiction? Does it produce anguish? Does it cause sleepless nights? Well, if not, then you've not understood it or accepted the story correctly. You have, like those righteous Hegelians, simply read and memorized it without dealing with the contradiction. You don't go too deeply into the story. You don't think about it too much for fear that its absurdity could shatter your scientific worldview. And so again, that night of infinite resignation is very firmly planted in the Hegelian world. He is thinking about himself. He is praising himself rather than praising God. In this image you have on the screen here, we have this notion of the absolute paradox being spelled out, the idea that God, an eternal being, can enter into time and join with a temporal being without destroying itself. As we've said, logically the idea is absurd, but to accept Christ or to accept Abraham, who Kierkegaard considers a God-man, we have to accept this as possible and hence take that leap of faith. You see the image, which is taken from the third Indiana Jones movie. Indiana Jones is trying to find the Holy Grail, and he's following these clues that are in his father's diary, and he comes to this point where here is this giant abyss. He has to get over to the other side. There's no way of turning around and going back. He has to get over to the other side. But there's this massive abyss here. It's too wide to jump across. There's nothing to construct a bridge out of. It's too deep to climb down one side and climb back up the other. So how is he supposed to do it? And within the instruction it says, through a leap of faith. And so Indiana Jones has to basically just sort of step out into the nothingness, step out into the abyss. And sure enough, there is a bridge that'll carry you across. But the way the light reflection is and whatnot, you're not able to see it until you're already standing upon it. And so you had to take the leap of faith that you would be upheld, that you would be uplifted, even though logically you know that you would plummet to your death in doing so. That's the leap of faith, to let go of that absurdity and to embrace everything, to put everything on the line because you believe through that absolute faith. As I mentioned, the night of infinite resignation is very firmly planted in that Hegelian world, and this person thinks about himself. He praises himself when he praises God. The night of faith, on the other hand, only thinks about God and nothing else. We had this idea of those people that we all know that are going to get dressed in their very finest attire and show up to church late so that everybody sees them as they walk in. They'll sit down in the front rows so that everybody notices them. They'll sing off key. They'll do everything they can to try to make sure that they are noticed, because they are there to be seen so that everybody can see what good little Christians they are. But those people aren't there to worship God. Those people are there to have people worship them, to have people think well of them. It's about praising themselves. But on the other hand, you have the guy that walks in the t-shirt and scrubby jeans and sits in the back and nobody even notices. If they do, they might look at him with a sigh of disgust. But yet that might be the holiest person in the room. That's the night of faith, because he's not concerned with what anyone thinks about himself. He's not concerned with making an image or an impression within the material condition. He is only concerned with finding that link to God, finding that relationship. And so we want to be that night of faith. We do not want to be anything else. When we apply all of this to the story of Abraham, we see what Kierkegaard calls a double movement. The night of faith, when he resigned to everything infinitely and then grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. This is a double movement. And this double movement consists in the movement of the infinite resignation and the movement of faith. Abraham's story illustrates this point. By faith, Abraham does not renounce his claim to Isaac, but by faith he got Isaac back. By embracing the paradox, Abraham becomes the father of faith itself. In the next video, we will take a look at the three problematas, which are actually the longest section of the text, but in terms of being able to explain and finish off the basic ideas, it's actually the easiest. So we'll pick that up in our final video.